Picture this. It's a normal morning in Los Angeles. You pull into a gas station, swipe your card, and for half a second, you do what every American does now. You glance at the price sign, hoping it didn't jump overnight. But today it did. Not by a few cents, by a lot. And while you're standing there, staring at the numbers, the news alert on your phone says something most people in the US feel is far away. Fighting around Iran is escalating, ships are rerouting, and energy markets are panicking. Here's the part that sounds crazy until you see the map. The first place to truly feel the shock isn't always America, it's Asia. And when Asia panics about energy, the ripple hits your wallet, your grocery bill, and your job faster than you'd expect. Welcome back to Economy Reboot. Today we're breaking down why an Iran-centered conflict risk can push Asia to the edge of an energy panic, what that panic actually looks like in real life, and why the US can't just shrug and say, that's over there. Because in energy, over there becomes right here in a matter of weeks, sometimes days. Before we jump in, if you like clear, story-driven breakdowns of the economy, no jargon, no noise, hit subscribe. It helps the channel a lot, and it means you'll catch the next video when the next big global shock hits, because there's always another one coming. Now, quick honesty check. When people say IranWar, they often mean a range of scenarios: a direct war, a regional escalation, maritime attacks, sanctions tightening, proxy conflicts heating up, or simply enough tension that shipping and insurance markets behave like a war is already happening. In this video, I'm not claiming secret information or predicting exact events. I'm explaining the real-world mechanics, how energy supply routes, pricing, and panic work, so you understand why even the risk of wider conflict around Iran can throw Asia into a scramble that the rest of the world can't ignore. Let's start with the simple question. Why Asia first? Why not the US or Europe? The answer is dependency, geography, and timing. A huge share of Asia's oil and gas is imported, and a major chunk of those imports are tied, directly or indirectly, to the Persian Gulf. And one narrow choke point, one DAS, acts like a valve for a meaningful portion of global energy flows, the Strait of Hormuz. It's not a long name you hear at dinner, but it's one of those places that quietly decides whether the world feels calm or suddenly feels broke. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow stretch of water that connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the ocean. A large portion of the world's seaborne oil passes through it. Many estimates commonly put it around 1/5 of global oil consumption moving through that corridor. And it's not just oil. Liquefied natural gas, especially from Qatar, is part of the picture too. So when anything threatens safe passage, mines, drones, missile strikes nearby, harassment of commercial vessels, or even just enough tension that insurers get nervous, shipping costs go up, delays start, and available supply shrinks even if the oil technically still exists in the ground. Here's where panic begins. Panic is not just fear. Panic is math colliding with time. Countries can't pause energy demand the way you pause a subscription. Power plants need fuel, factories need electricity, truck fleets need diesel, households need cooking gas, and in many Asian economies, energy demand is tightly connected to growth, exports, and political stability. So if leaders think supply might get cut next month, they don't wait. They bid for supply now. That just in case buying is what turns stress into a spike. Imagine being an energy buyer in Japan, South Korea, or India. Your job is to ensure your country doesn't face blackouts or industrial shutdowns. You're staring at the same headlines everyone is reading, but the difference is you have a purchase order in front of you worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and if you get it wrong, the consequences are national. If the risk is rising, you don't buy the cheapest cargo. You buy the cargo you can actually get. You pay for reliability, you pay for speed. And when many buyers do that at once, prices don't rise gradually, they jump. Now let's make this concrete with a story. Meet Daniel. Daniel isn't a politician. He runs procurement for a large manufacturing firm in Southeast Asia, electronics components, the kind that end up in cars, appliances, and a lot of products Americans use every day. Daniel's plant is efficient, automated, and runs on a tight schedule, but it depends on stable electricity. When fuel costs rise, utilities raise rates, and when fuel is uncertain, utilities sometimes ration power. Daniel's nightmare isn't energy is expensive, it's energy is unavailable on Tuesday. Because one day of lost production can wreck shipping deadlines, contract penalties, and relationships with US customers. That's why, when the market feels shaky, Daniel's company starts building inventory, securing backup generators, and paying more for shipping, costs that eventually land in the prices you and I pay. Energy panic also has a second gear, shipping. Even if oil is flowing, the market can act like it isn't if shipping becomes complicated. Tankers don't just teleport barrels. They need routes, crews, port access, and insurance. If insurers decide the Gulf is a high-risk zone, premiums spike. Some ships might avoid the area, others demand hazard pay. Some owners only sail if governments provide security. At rerouting and delays and the effective supply tightens, the market reacts to that tightening like it's a shortage, because functionally it is. So why does Asia get hit hardest? Because Asia buys so much of its energy by sea, and a lot of it originates from or passes near the Gulf. The US produces a lot of oil and gas domestically, which provides a buffer. But buffer doesn't mean immunity, and we'll get to that. Asia, by contrast, includes some of the biggest importers on Earth. When they scramble, they're not just changing their own prices, they're changing the global price of the next available barrel. Now, let's talk about what energy panic looks like beyond the charts. It looks like governments quietly calling emergency meetings with utilities and major industrial users. It looks like officials asking refineries to build extra inventory. It looks like strategic petroleum reserves being discussed, maybe partially released, maybe conserved. It looks like politicians asking the public to conserve energy, sometimes with very practical measures, reduced lighting, changes in public transport schedules, or incentives to shift industrial use off peak hours. It can also look like a sudden surge in coal usage if gas is scarce, because when the choice is dirty but available versus clean but missing, economies choose available. And then, because this is the real world, panic looks like everyone trying to avoid being the last one to buy. That's the psychological part. Energy markets are not just supply and demand, they're expectations. The expectation of future scarcity can cause present hoarding. The expectation of future price hikes causes today's bidding war. That's how you get a self-reinforcing spike. Now, let's bring the US into the frame. If America is producing so much oil, why do Americans still care? Because oil is globally priced. Even if a lot of US consumption is supplied domestically, the price you pay is still linked to global benchmarks. If global prices jump, US gasoline prices usually feel it, and that flows into inflation. You can be driving on American crude and still be paying international anxiety at the pump. Plus, there's a second channel. The US economy doesn't exist alone. If Asia slows down because of energy costs or disruptions, that can hit global demand for US exports, impact multinational earnings, and shake financial markets. If energy costs spike globally, central banks have to think about inflation again. And if inflation reaccelerates, the US Federal Reserve's decisions on interest rates get more complicated. That means mortgages, car loans, credit cards, business investment, everything. So when you hear Asia on the brink of an energy panic, it's not just their problem. It's a chain reaction that can boomerang into American living costs and jobs. Now let's zoom into the part most people miss. Asia's energy system is not one system. It's a patchwork, and that patchwork can spread panic faster. Japan and South Korea are major importers of both oil and LNG. China is a massive importer, but also has coal and domestic production and pipelines, giving it options. Still painful, but options. India is highly price sensitive because energy costs hit households and budgets quickly. Southeast Asia includes both producers and importers depending on the country. And infrastructure varies widely. Some places can switch fuels, some cannot. Some have strategic reserves, some have minimal storage. When the risk spikes, the weakest links feel it first, and then the scramble spreads because everyone competes for the same cargoes. Here's another important piece. LNG. Natural gas shipped as LNG has become a major swing fuel for many Asian countries, especially for power generation. But the LNG market can be even tighter than oil in the short run, because liquefaction and regasification capacity are specialized. If Asia suddenly needs more LNG, it often has to outbid someone else for it. That someone else can be Europe, or it can be emerging markets that simply can't pay. And when those countries can't pay, they may face power shortages. That's when energy becomes political stability, not just economics. Now, how does the market translate risk into price? There's the immediate risk premium. Traders price in the chance that supply gets disrupted. Even if nothing happens, the probability alone can lift prices. Then there's the physical market response. Buyers seeking cargoes, suppliers holding back, shipping constraints, and inventory behavior. And then there's speculation, people trading futures based on expected moves. Speculation isn't automatically evil. It can add liquidity, but in tense moments, it can amplify swings. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, but surely there are backups. Can't Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and others just reroute? Sometimes, yes, partially. There are pipelines that bypass Hormuz in limited quantities, and there are alternative routes, but they do not replace the full flow. Think of it like a city with one major bridge and a couple side roads. If the bridge is threatened, traffic can still move, but not at normal volume, not without delays and costs. Markets hate that uncertainty. Now let's keep the story moving with a US-focused angle. Meet Erica. Erica runs a small delivery business in the Midwest. She doesn't follow geopolitics. She follows fuel costs. If gas and diesel rise, she has to either raise delivery fees or eat the cost. If she raises fees, Customers complain or shop elsewhere. If she eats the cost, her profit margin collapses. She's already dealing with insurance, vehicle maintenance, and higher interest rates on financing. Energy shocks are brutal because they hit everywhere at once. And when small businesses feel it, hiring slows. That's how a faraway conflict can show up as, why are there fewer job openings? Months later. Now, let's talk about what makes this particular kind of shock so dangerous for Asia. Timing and inventory. Many countries keep reserves, but reserves are not infinite, and they're not always designed to cover prolonged disruption. Companies also keep inventory, but modern supply chains often run just in time because storage costs money. In a calm market, just in time is efficient. In a crisis, it's fragile. When the market sense changes from plenty to maybe not enough, the whole system shifts from just in time to just in case. And just in case is expensive. That shift is the panic. It's not just price, it's behavior. It's governments and companies turning into preppers, but for national energy security. There's also a political layer. If energy prices rise sharply in Asia, governments face public anger. In many countries, fuel prices and electricity prices are politically sensitive. Some governments subsidize fuel. When global prices rise, subsidies become costly, blowing holes in budgets. If they remove subsidies, voters feel the pain directly. Either way, the pressure increases. That can lead to policy decisions like export controls, price caps, emergency measures, or rushed deals with alternative suppliers. Those policies can then distort markets further. Now let's connect the dots to America again, because the US audience question is always, what's my takeaway? Here are the main channels, and you'll see why the story stays interesting beyond 4 minutes. First, gasoline and diesel prices. Even with US production, global crude price moves matter. Second, inflation. Energy is a headline driver and also a quiet input into almost everything. Third, interest rates. If inflation ticks up again, rate cuts can be delayed. Fourth, corporate earnings. Higher shipping and input costs squeeze margins. Fifth, supply chains. If Asian factories face higher power costs or intermittent supply, lead times stretch. Sixth, geopolitics itself. The US might face pressure to respond through diplomacy, sanctions, naval security, or coordination with allies, actions that can further affect markets. And here's the twist that keeps the story from being simple. Sometimes an energy shock can also cause demand destruction. If prices spike enough, economies slow. That can bring prices down later. So you can see a violent up and down pattern. Spike, panic, slowdown, drop, then instability. That volatility is its own kind of damage because businesses can't plan. Now let's talk about the most misunderstood phrase in all of this. Energy independence. Americans hear it and think it means we're safe. What it really means is we have more domestic supply options than we used to. That's good, it matters. But we're still inside a global pricing system, a global shipping system, and a global economy. If you export and import energy products, and the US does, then you're connected. If global prices move, your domestic prices feel it. If your allies are stressed, your strategic landscape changes. The US may be more resilient than many, but not insulated. Now, what about Asia specifically? Why call it on the brink? Because Asia is where energy demand growth has been concentrated for decades. Many Asian economies are energy hungry, and many of them don't have the luxury of switching quickly. If the Gulf is unstable, the immediate alternatives are limited and costly. That's why the panic risk is higher. Think about what alternatives look like in a crunch. You can try to buy more from the US, but shipping LNG across the world takes time and capacity. You can buy more from Australia, but that market may already be tight. You can buy more from Russia, but geopolitics, sanctions, and reputational risks complicate transactions for many buyers. You can burn more coal, but that clashes with climate goals and sometimes local air quality politics. You can slow industry, but that hits jobs and exports. None of these choices are painless, and panic is what happens when your choices are all bad. Another layer is currency. Many energy purchases are priced in US dollars. If the dollar is strong, energy is more expensive for countries with weaker currencies. So a geopolitical energy shock combined with a strong dollar can feel like a double hit for parts of Asia. That can trigger broader financial stress, higher import bills, larger trade deficits, pressure on foreign exchange reserves, and in extreme cases, the kind of policy tightening that slows growth. Again, that feeds back into global markets. Now, you might wonder, if Asia panics and starts bidding up energy, doesn't that help US producers? In some ways, yes. Higher prices can mean higher revenues for producers, and US LNG exporters may see strong demand, but the net effect on the average American can still be negative if higher energy costs raise inflation and squeeze consumers. It's a distribution problem. Some sectors win, many households lose. That's why politically, energy shocks are toxic. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz again, because the entire story circles back to one uncomfortable truth. Choke points are leverage. If you can threaten a choke point, you can shake the global economy without ever winning a traditional battle. Markets don't wait for a full shutdown. They react to the possibility. That's why the phrase brink of panic is so accurate. You don't need the worst case. You just need enough uncertainty that everyone changes behavior at the same time. Now, to keep this practical, here are the signs you'd watch if you were trying to figure out whether this is becoming a true energy panic in Asia. 1. Shipping insurance rates and reported tanker reroutes. 2. Freight rates for tankers and LNG carriers. 3. Emergency policy statements from major Asian importers about stockpiling or conservation. 4. Sudden shifts in refinery run rates or import tenders. 5. Price spreads between regional benchmarks showing localized stress. 6. Currency moves in energy importing nations, because currency weakness can accelerate panic buying. And 7. Reports of power rationing or industrial curtailments, which are the real-world pain signal beyond prices. If you're watching from the US, another sign matters: how quickly US gasoline prices respond and how media coverage frames it. Because once energy becomes a domestic political story, policy responses can follow. Strategic reserve releases, pressure on refiners, diplomatic pushes, or calls for increased production. Those responses can change market expectations, which can then move prices again. It's a feedback loop. Now let's get into why this story keeps viewers hooked until the end. The outcome is not one thing. It's a set of paths, and each path changes the global economy differently. So instead of giving you a single prediction, I'm going to walk you through a few realistic scenario lanes so you can recognize which lane the world is entering as events unfold. Lane 1 contained tension, high-risk premium. In this lane, incidents happen or threats rise, but shipping continues with added cost. Prices rise, but the world adapts. Asia pays more, governments subsidize more, and growth slows a bit. The US sees higher gas prices and sticky inflation. No total crisis, but lots of economic annoyance. Lane 2, partial disruption. In this lane, some flows are interrupted. Some ports slow down, insurance becomes extremely expensive, and shipping capacity tightens. Asia scrambles hard, LNG becomes a battlefield of bids, and some emerging markets get priced out. That can lead to rolling power issues in the most vulnerable places. Global manufacturing costs rise. US inflation returns as a bigger headline, and rate policy gets tougher. Markets get choppy. Lane 3, major disruption. In this lane, a large portion of flows through the Gulf are blocked or severely reduced for a period. This is the nightmare lane. Strategic reserves get tapped. Governments coordinate emergency releases. Demand destruction becomes a real thing, meaning economic contraction in places that can't afford the energy. This lane can create recession risk globally. I'm not saying this is what will happen. I'm saying this is the lane market's fear, and that fear alone can move prices. Now here's a question that should be bothering you by now. If Asia is panicking, why doesn't it just buy ahead and be safe? Because buying ahead is exactly what creates panic. It's the stadium exit problem. If everyone walks calmly, it's fine. If everyone runs, because they think others will run, people get hurt. Energy markets work like that. The system can tolerate normal stockpiling. It cannot tolerate everyone stockpiling at once without a price spike. And that spike is not just a number. It's a transfer of money from consumers to producers, a squeeze on budgets, and a force that can change politics. In Asia, it can change election outcomes, subsidy policies, and foreign relations. In the US, it can change the inflation narrative, the political conversation, and even the mood of the consumer. Now let's add the shipping and supply chain layer that Americans feel but rarely connect to energy. When energy costs rise, shipping costs often rise too. Container shipping depends on fuel, air freight depends on jet fuel, trucking depends on diesel. So even if your product has nothing to do with oil, say a toy, a laptop, or a piece of furniture, the cost to move it goes up. And if Asian manufacturers face higher power costs, they may raise prices or cut output. That means fewer goods, higher prices, or longer delivery times. It's 2020's supply chain stress, but triggered by energy risk rather than a pandemic. So what can governments do? They have a toolkit, but none of the tools are magic. Strategic reserves can smooth short-term shocks, but they can't replace continuous supply if the disruption is prolonged. Diplomacy can reduce tension, but it takes time and requires cooperation. Naval escorts can reduce risk for shipping, but they don't eliminate it, and they can escalate tensions if handled poorly. Subsidies can protect consumers, but they strain budgets. Price controls can backfire if they cause shortages. Demand reduction campaigns can help, but they're politically unpopular. Fuel switching can occur, but it's limited by infrastructure. In Asia, one of the most immediate hidden tools is simply forcing industry to share the pain. Governments can prioritize residential electricity and cut industrial usage during peaks. That protects households but harms exports and growth. If that happens at scale, it can show up in US stores as fewer goods or higher prices. Again, boomerang. Now, let's keep the human story going. Imagine you're a family in a big Asian city. Electricity is stable most days. You don't think about where energy comes from. Then prices start rising. Your utility sends a message asking people to conserve during evening hours. Then the news talks about emergency imports and higher costs. Your grocery bill rises because transportation costs rose. This is how panic becomes social stress. And social stress becomes policy pressure. And policy pressure becomes market-moving decisions. It's all connected. Back in the US, the same pattern is quieter, but still real. Higher gas prices change driving behavior. Higher energy input costs change company pricing. If people feel squeezed, they spend less on non-essentials. Retail slows, hiring slows. And if the Fed remains cautious because inflation is stubborn, borrowing stays expensive. That combination, consumer squeeze plus high rates, is how shocks turn into slowdowns. Now, there's one more twist that matters a lot. Not all Asian countries panic in the same way, and that can create winners and losers. Countries with long-term contracts and diversified suppliers feel less stress. Countries with limited storage and spot market buying feel more stress. Countries with domestic coal and flexible generation can pivot, even if it's dirty. Countries relying heavily on imported LNG without strong contracts can face severe pricing. This unevenness can reshape regional relationships. Some countries may deepen ties with certain suppliers, sign emergency deals, or accelerate investments in renewables and nuclear. The panic can, ironically, speed up long-term energy transitions, because nothing motivates a government like a crisis. And that brings us to the most interesting question. Does an energy panic accelerate change, or just cause pain? The answer is both. In the short run, it's pain. In the medium run, it can drive investment in alternatives, more renewables, more grid storage, more nuclear, more efficiency, more interconnections, and more strategic stockpiles. But those changes take years. The panic happens in weeks. So what should the average US viewer do with this information? I'm not here to tell you what to buy or sell. This isn't financial advice, but you can watch for the signals, understand why prices are moving, and not get blindsided when the international story shows up as a domestic cost. You can also understand why US policy conversations about energy production, refining capacity, strategic reserves, and alliances suddenly get loud whenever the Gulf is unstable. Now I want to pull the camera back for the last few minutes, because the biggest takeaway is the simplest. The world runs on energy confidence. When confidence is high, prices are boring, supply chains hum, and inflation stays calmer. When confidence breaks, everyone pays more to protect themselves, and those protection costs become the new price of living. An Iran-centered conflict risk is uniquely powerful because it sits near a critical corridor and because the Gulf's energy is deeply wired into Asia's growth engine. If Asia starts to believe supply is truly at risk, it doesn't wait politely. It bids, it stockpiles, it locks contracts. And that behavior can push the entire world into a higher cost environment. Now let me ask you something, because I want to hear from you in the comments. If energy prices spike sharply because of Middle East tensions, what do you think governments should prioritize first? Keeping household prices low, keeping industry running, or keeping inflation under control, even if it means higher pain now? Drop your take in the comments, because different answers lead to very different economic outcomes. And if you found this breakdown useful, share this video with one friend who always says, "Why do gas prices change so fast?" Because this is why. It's not just the local station. It's global risk, global shipping, and global behavior all colliding. As we wrap up, remember the big picture. Energy panic isn't only about barrels and charts. It's about trust in supply. And when that trust breaks, especially in Asia, the world's manufacturing heart, prices, politics, and the everyday cost of life can shift quickly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe to Economy Reboot. We'll keep tracking the signals, cutting through the noise, and explaining the economic story behind the headlines, calmly, clearly, and without the hype. One last thing before you go. Do you think the world is more vulnerable to energy shocks today than it was 10 years ago, or less? Tell me why in the comments. I read them, and your answers help shape what we cover next.